Well, we have our team here from SmithGroup and Synthesis to present the draft of the Bear Creek Park Master Plan. Greg?
Tag team this a little bit. So.
Yes.
Well, thanks for having us tonight. It's exciting. I think it's been about a year. I think it's probably been almost a year exactly. So really excited to be where we're at in the process. So intentional journey, maybe, very, very thoughtful, slow cooked, I think is what we sort of promised with the process. And it's always rewarding when you kind of put all these steps together, what we've been through in terms of stakeholders and site tours and community meetings and kids and everything. It's been a really great ride for us. And I think it's a great plan because of that too. So I think the whole team should be proud. I know we are as consultants really proud of the plan and glad to share it tonight. So the agenda for our presentation, we will, there's a lot of slides in here, but we will not be taking 5 minutes per slide. We'll go through fairly quickly. But a little bit of background. So hopefully by the end of this, you won't even have to read the report, that you will live it here tonight. But kind of the key pieces of the report really makes up our agenda tonight. So a little bit of just some of the history, of the site, kind of which really sets up some of the design decisions we made. Talk about a little bit of the public process. Talk about how we got here in terms of the alternatives. And I know Michael has been giving regular briefings on that, but we'll go into a little bit more detail and kind of maybe some decisions on how we got to a preferred. And then we'll talk about some of the financials as well. And then we'll have some time for questions if you have them. So again, I think you all know a little bit about the property, but just from a context perspective, it was kind of interesting to look at the sort of the site today. And it's actually changed even from this aerial photograph. I was out there this morning and looking at the construction next door, at the development. And so I think every time this aerial is looked at, it probably is growing a little bit more with this part of the community, which is part of the story, that this park is not only, sort of fills a gap in your park system, but also it's one of your newest and fastest growing areas of the community as well too. And so it's sort of just in time for that. And so I think, finding a creative way to engage the community in that was really, a big part of the challenge here, so that we were able to anticipate some of the residents that are kind of coming and some of the new voices that you're hearing as part of the community. Historically, there are some lessons learned as we kind of look at some of the patterns of how this site is developed. Again, looking kind of before many people lived on this part of the community. The creek has always been, sort of a kind of a quiet player on this site when it's been farmed. And you start to see as you get into the, from the 40s into the 80s of some of the development around it, but it was still, even in 85, pretty open land. One thing we found was interesting, looking in the 98. This was just before some of the plantations were put in place. So kind of one of the last pictures when this was fully farmed, before the prairies and some of the things that you have out there today, is the creek again had already been sort of tamed and humanized with farming, but you got a little bit of remnant that Jay found looking at some of the aerials of maybe what it wanted to be or what it kind of maybe was in the past as well. So, some of the meanders and things like that. So when you start to get into the concept of the wandering bear, for example, that was some of the inspiration of, if you stop farming it and let it be what it wants to be in a park setting, it might do some things like that, which brings other benefits too. So again, looking back does give us some lessons moving forward. Kind of getting a little closer today. This was, the most recent aerial photograph and some of the drone footage that parks took, where you start to see really the classic pattern of the north meadow, the south meadow, the north oak rooms with the sort of the gridded pattern of the oaks, and Bear Creek through the middle. And depending on various ones of us see different versions of bears. I know that's, I think Michael, you see a different version than we see, but we all see bears in the aerial here somewhere. Yeah, of course, Michael's is correct. So again, public process, we've, I think doing this not only intentionally sort of slow and intentional, but also doing this through a pandemic where we started, I think the idea of doing, the in-person public meetings, the surveys, the kind of keeping things open, we really did get a lot of data that way. And I think people, we had good turnout, but we also had great feedback, from the online surveys that we typically left open for a month or so after public meetings. It told us all sorts of things, where people came from, what they wanted to do, what parks they use, things like that as well too, which again was very helpful. And some of that, high level programming, or lack thereof, passive use trails, things like that as well too. So, early on that gave us a good indication, as well as some of the feedback we got during those early meetings of, where this park wanted to be on the spectrum of structured programming to very, natural and sort of, open. And again, I think that was an interesting, and like a lot of the process, it was sort of right down the middle, which is not surprising. You go back to, again, your community, that you've got a very fast, diverse growing part of town, lots of families, and this is the only park out there. So there was a whole, group of voices that wanted recreation and programs and things to do. At the same time, there was a very big respect for the natural environment out there. Again, of the parks that we've worked on, it had one of the best sort of head starts in terms of the prairies and the woodlands and the creek, things like that as well too. So I think we heard loud and clear, find a balance in there, but make sure that it's this idea of maybe having a great sort of nature escape where you can play in nature was definitely a theme. So, trying to find a good balance of having those more traditional things as well as just, wide open spaces, trails, things like that. I think, again, huge hats off to the Carmel Clay team. During a pandemic, staff shortages, all of that, of listening to us and opening up a park temporarily, putting trails out there for us to use in a master planning process. Michael Allen's kids being open for photographs. Again, it was really above and beyond. But it gave us a whole different insight when we came down to park planning. We were out there a lot more. I think the team was a lot more. Hopefully, some of you also were out there. And in the community, those people that came to meetings that had been out there, they definitely had a very different connection and engagement in the process. I think because of being able to get out there, whether it was just one of our stakeholder meetings or whether it was on one of the weekends when it was open. We definitely again took what started in West Park Master Plan and sort of grew in West Park schematic design and implementation. Has definitely become a lot of momentum here in terms of engaging all ages, getting to the kids, again, finding creative ways to do it, whether it was going to them in classrooms, whether it was mayor's teens groups coming to the barn. Probably one of the highlights of my career, I think, was a freezing afternoon charrette with a bunch of teenagers that actually ordinarily would not be there. Two of them drawing schemes, pinning up with each other. Again, these are all the ideas. It wasn't just for fashion to have meetings. Every one of these started to advance the ideas that are in the plan. You started to see some very common threads, the idea of aerial play and, again, that balance of that active and that natural came through, again, through all ages, which was fantastic. Having activities like that, it really started to give us an indication where people wanted to see things and where they didn't. So I think, when we had that program kind of worked out earlier, again, I think people being able to get out to the site and think and really understanding what does Zone 1, what does that Oak Room look like, what should go up there, what should go by the river, things like that. So again, I think, that was really a nice culmination when it came down to actually put pen to paper. We felt very informed by that. And then kind of wrapping up that early phase, we started to set, again, really the bar that would drive all of the alternatives, which was this bigger vision and drivers. Again, really thinking about this being an innovative, inclusive, and resilient community park. Again, community park being really key, that this is it's serving the immediate neighborhood, but also 3 miles out, 5 miles out, growing families, everything we talked about, but grounded in the natural fabric of the site, and it's shaped by the need for a unique and culturally diverse experience. So the connectivity wasn't just about trails and roads, it was about, again, personal connections and cultural connections and programs as well, too. And trying to find sort of our perfect sweet spot where the bear sits is right in between these really kind of big ideas of an activated escape, a resilient model, and a connected experience that starts to become the theme throughout our design. And that really drove these kind of big ideas that you'll see through the presentation here that we have aligned things with. And it's in the report as well. The idea of a bigger bear, which is really about the resilience and it's about ecology, of trying to, again, really bring the bear, whatever it looks like to you, to make it the best, biggest piece of ecology that it can be as the driver, the namesake. Trying to find the way to have this be a great place. Bear sightings was the idea of being connected physically, programmatically, things to do, seen in nature, place to come together as a community. And engage the bear was trying to find that right balance of leveraging that environment without overwhelming it. So trying to find a way to use that edge with the creek to bring in some of those community needs, programs, things like that. So that really got us into the alternatives. I think probably the last thing we've shared with you, we had 3 different alternatives that were, again, distinctly different. but all achieve that same, core program. We got Bear Towers, which was really, punctuated by the idea of sort of towers, sort of fire tower themes, had a little different pattern in terms of where, picnicking was to the south. North was a very densely programmed campus. And then the middle was really sort of left open, and then no road connection. So Braided Bear was another option that started to look at maybe a different way of the creek could be designed, bringing in that bigger bear into sort of a braided stream, starting to spread out that program north and south. This one did show the idea of a road connection, which got a lot of feedback. Probably one of the top feedback items. Either hated it or kind of liked it. I think more people probably hated it than liked it, but they were. It was an interesting discussion because, again, I think some of the lessons you've had with Central Park and West Park, people wanted to have a good discussion about whether you needed the drive between. I think ultimately we heard pretty clear that the park isn't really big enough to need that. But they did love the idea of one of the drivers here was probably the most popular things was the idea of canopy play to the south. So people liked the tower. The tower idea in option 1, they liked the canopy play in option 2, and they really liked the idea in Wandering Bear of a more linear creek experience as well too. So, so we sort of took all of that feedback and started to come up with a crafted plan that really brought the best of those schemes together without it being just a collage. It was so I would say it was probably a lot of Braided Bear with some of the fabric of Wandering Bear, but the idea of actually bringing a tower in. So you'll see that in the preferred alternative here. So this is the draft master plan, the preferred alternative, which I'll walk you through. And again, in your report, it's sort of organized through the way I'm going to do it here tonight. So this is really, it's divided up into a series of districts, just how I'll present it here. So the area to the north where the community's pavilion will be, we call it base camp, which is really the largest building, the largest concentration of parking. The Oak Rooms, again, that area kind of knit into the plantation. The Perch, which is the canopy play area to the south over the Creekside, which starts to become some of the boardwalk areas we'll talk about, and then really the South Prairie, and pretty much everything south of the creek becomes kind of one holistic district that we'll talk about. And then the other thing that we've been recognizing all the way through, especially as development's happening, to the east, is trying to make sure that we recognize this broader Bear Creek corridor, greenway connections, trails, habitat, all of that, to making sure that, from a trail perspective, we're making sure that we're linking into that. Because I think ultimately, this is a 27-acre site, but it becomes part of a much larger thing with that kind of mentality. So we didn't design that, but we definitely have been mindful of that in all of our designs. So kind of looking at the districts, this is the base camp area. As I mentioned, the big drivers here was the Community Pavilion. Janelle will talk about this a little bit more in detail in a little bit, as well as the areas around it. So if you think about Permanent Pavilion that has the plazas around it, so very similar idea that the building can be an indoor experience. It can spill out, whether that's a camp or whether it's a public meeting or other activities. It has a small area of supporting turf space that can be used again for those same kinds of events. And then areas just to be seen, casual space. We definitely heard, again, probably a pandemic driver was, people who are starting to use parks for work and other things, schoolwork, want Wi-Fi, all of that too. So these plaza spaces, having, attractive seating, whether it's tables, whether it's swings, things like that, could all be part of that community living room experience that is part of the outside, kind of the outdoor equivalent of what's inside the building. And then, we took that idea from that first option of the towers, but we moved it. So in that concept, it was sort of right, kind of on the knoll that you kind of see in the middle of this slide. We moved it further north for a couple reasons. One was neighbors. We didn't want to have, a 30-foot tower kind of right in somebody's backyard. That we definitely heard that feedback at the public meetings. But we also liked the idea of that being in a place where this park could get a beacon for 146th and Shelbourne. So kind of a signature element that you could see from outside, but also that, would be a draw in itself. And so the idea was to kind of bring that as an element on the north, and you'll see there's a counterpart on the south, which is the canopy play. And so that becomes a feature in itself, but also becomes a catalyst for a lot of the more active stuff that we heard a lot from the families and from the teenagers and such as well. So, water play moved into this area, nature play, outdoor classroom spaces, sports courts. That's something that we were kind of surprised to hear as much support as we did, but not really surprised if you think about the community, park role it's playing. So some hard space, that could be for basketball or it could be for pickleball or things like that. I mean, I think to be determined, but some, sports court areas. And then, starting to think about some of those spaces where you see area 2 that could be outdoor classroom, but also using the tower itself could start to maybe bring, again, zip lines, other things like that into here as well. So thinking about the tower as, again, that catalyst for a more adventure-based, play, kind of, but the idea of taking those openings in the Oaks as different rooms that could be programmed for different, more actively recreational things. And then, as I promised, sort of across to the south, we're really at the location of the old house. If you think about where the house was, it sits up on a bluff. And if you sort of just launch off of that elevation, you're up in kind of in the canopy level. There's a bunch of large walnuts and large trees over there, maples and such. So the idea was, if you kind of think about the tower's idea, if you take the south tower and sort of tip it and do it this way, that was the idea, was sort of taking, and inspired by that grid of the trees to the north. So if you think about the oaks kind of making that grid, the thought here was, let's have this very natural form of the creek and the landscape, but let's think about boardwalks and that aerial play as maybe being more, human-based, human form, and taking the inspiration of the oak grid and doing it in the land, in some of the spaces here. So the idea was, again, tree houses, chutes and ladders has been sort of the theme within the team, that this would be just an experience of different levels, different ages, chutes, ladders, slides. Again, to be determined some of this, I think, in terms of the design, but definitely the idea of sort of getting up in the canopy as an escape, as an adventure area, but also using that as a way to cross the creek. So again, I think there's some things to still figure out in future phases of the design. But the idea that you could cross low on boardwalks and maybe cross high, and they all sort of connect accessibly with your chutes and ladders and ramps. And then at that lower level would be a boardwalk system that would have a similar sort of pattern to that, but obviously be down at that ground level. And so some of it would be sort of throughways as part of the main trail system. Others would be, think of this as sort of an outdoor classroom experience where I can go off onto a little grid and off to a little space. Maybe there's a small shelter, maybe a small kiosk. But the idea is to sort of get lost in that creek corridor and start to, whether it's just hanging out, whether it's tied into camps, other programs, you see some images of what that could start to look like. Here's another image of what that could look like. This is sort of sitting up in the canopy area, looking down on that lower level creek side. And then finally hopping across, this was an area that we kept, a little, so you've got that perch, but tied to that would be an outdoor picnic lawn, as well as some small pavilions and shelters and toilets, some, passive trails through the prairie. I would say similar to what you see sort of in the East Woods sort of picnic grove kind of idea. That would be its own thing, but also would be a nice support for that canopy play. And then, as I mentioned, making sure that we are recognizing that this all is part of a broader greenway system, that, from a character perspective, from signage and some of the branding that you've got in Carmel Clay, we would, obviously want to do that with some of the interpretive information and such. So that's kind of the walkthrough geographically. Now, Janelle and I are going to walk through a couple of the key systems going back to these bigger drivers. So the bigger bear, again, is about resilience and ecology. Engage the bear is about activation and programming. And bear sightings is about connections and mobility. So I won't do this as much justice as Jay would do, but again, we had a really good start. You've got prairies, you've got woodlands, you've got a great creek system, you've got Indiana Bluffs. Central Indiana Bluffs. They're not southern Indiana Bluffs. But you've got topography. You've got some great clay to work with here. And so a lot of the effort here was to try to really get that, to maybe bring some other ingredients in, move the needle around a little bit, but ultimately really work with a lot of what we had. So it becomes this great little matrix of, the creek itself, wet meadow along the creek, prairie kind of working your way up into sort of savannas and woodlands as you get up to the top of the site. And you'll see we have a couple of these slides that start to talk about kind of before and the after by the numbers. And so on the left is today, although today's a little, I know there's some utility work happening out there. So I would say this was today during the master plan. And then kind of on the right is what the plan would include. So from an ecology perspective, you've got, again, prairie and savanna, wet meadow, creek, woodland, and developed spaces. So some of the woodland areas you'll see, so for example, we got a little bit less prairie and savanna. Some of that is it was converted into wet meadow. In some cases, it also was some of the areas that we did some development in. We actually have increased the amount of wet meadow, so that bigger bear idea, there's actually a much more robust and healthy riparian system along the creek. Woodlands have come down a little bit from an acre perspective, and some of that is a little bit's development, but some of it is what Jay, who's our team ecologist, was stressing is the creek is almost a little bit too wooded right now. Some of it's not great species, some of it's almost too much shade, that the ground plane is not healthy too. So he really wanted to get that opened up a little bit, start to get more light in there, start to get a healthy. So some of that acreage started to go into the wet prairie or the wet meadow, but some of it is, we do have development in terms of base camp, things like that as well too. But ultimately, this is kind of a cross section through what that starts to look like. So this is cutting right through the creek in the middle of the site. So you start to see how, on the left would be the South Prairie, Picnic Grove, kind of working your way down into the wet meadow, into the creek, kind of through the wet meadow, through the boardwalk, and kind of up the side towards the north. And then this is kind of the before and after. So what we had was really a lot of woodland, which is not really the greatest woodland, and quite a bit of prairie, and kind of what's proposed is a much more balanced diet of kind of all of those, which again, I think the feeling is that's a much more healthy ecosystem looking forward. So the next piece, kind of engage the bear, is the idea of what do we do out here? These are activities. So this kind of highlights kind of the active and passive balance of the site. And we won't go through all of them, but you start to see that there's a much higher concentration of active up in that oak rooms area, as well as the canopy play. And the passive starts to become, more of those outdoor classrooms, the plazas, the picnic groves, things like that, the boardwalks. And the report starts to have these illustrations that start to give you a sense of kind of how that all knits into the landscape. This is a cross section that cuts through the northern part of the site. So you've got the tower at one side of it, and sort of the parking lot at the other, with the community pavilion in the middle. And then sort of activating all of those natural spaces and those program spaces is a hierarchy of facilities. Primary structures, which is really the community pavilion, as well as really the support building for the perch on the south. There's secondary structures, which would be toilets, so you would have one of those on the south. You would also have one of those in around the spray ground, the oak rooms as well too. So we would use the toilets from the community pavilion, but we'd also want to have some satellite facilities that are tied to those programs. And then finally, there's also a whole host of open air shelters and pavilions, and then some lawn space that again is intentionally located near those for programming purposes. And again, from kind of by the numbers, there really isn't anything out there today. There's the barn, so we went from 0 to 7,200 square feet with the pavilion. We go from the barn, which is roughly 940 square feet, to roughly 2,400 with secondary structures. The open air is really all from scratch, and we've got about an acre of lawn out of the 27 acres, which is a pretty small amount in the grand scheme of things, which is something we definitely heard from the public as well as from the staff. And again, just kind of a sense of what that starts to look like. This was a cross section, working your way kind of north to south through the site. So at this point, I'm going to let Janelle walk us through one of the key features, which is the community pavilion.
Good evening. I'm going to lower this. Can you guys hear me okay? My voice tends not to carry. So when you look at a park like this, or a potential park, it's sometimes hard to find inspiration for a built structure or series of structures similar to what Greg has demonstrated. And so, when we started thinking back on all the conversations that we had with the public, with the park staff, we started to think about the mud stomping in the creek. I mean, the creek is the star. And so how do we engage the creek? How do we make that the highlight? But then how do we transition into the buildings and still honor the idea of the creek? So one of the things that we started to look at, and I grew up here in Indiana, not far from here, and understood what it is to go mud stomping as a kid. You're always finding these little wonderful geodes and shells and all kinds of artifacts. And so we started to do some research and discovered that universities are doing studies of that very thing across Indiana because of the proliferation of material that can be found. So we started to look at that as a concept for organizing built form. And so if you think about fossils, you think about finding all of these nuggets within the landscape, how does that transition? Well, one of the images you see on the bottom right here are the found objects left behind when the water recedes. There's a randomness to it. So we started to look at how that could start to inform potential locations of buildings or start to break the scale of the building down into smaller components. With that, then, we started to look at various materials that would be homogeneous with the materials you would find in the area, stone, wood, different metals, and play around with these notions of what could be and how we start to bring those two ideas together. In doing that, we started to also then develop these concept studies that you see along the left. We started out with a much more orthogonal, more traditional look, still using individual units, but then started to play around with modifying the forms to become more playful on the landscape and pulling them apart so that you could start to create the indoor space that's needed to satisfy programming needs, but then also create the found space in the exterior form. And ultimately then you see the four different views of the form that we started to look at. We're starting to see this as more monolithic instead of traditional walls, roof, but have material that starts to come down around each one of these pods so that it creates these sort of remnants, if you will, if you think back to the creek bed and leaving behind these gems. So you start to see here, we're also looking at, you see in the image in the middle bottom slide with the undulating wall, there's a variety of different materials that we started playing around with. Even at a master plan level, we wanted to start to have a notion of what could happen and started playing around with this idea of solids versus translucent versus transparent. And so instead of actually having a hard punched opening, what would happen if it becomes more organic feeling? And we start to play around with the way we can develop materials to go from that opaque, translucent to transparent. And so that's up for further investigation. But at this point, you start to see the different ways that you could generate textures and a variety of different applications. Here's another view. This would be from the meadow looking up, and it was really important to us also to consider that this is a 360 building. There's no front, there's no back. Because you experience it from the north as you enter into the site, you experience it from the east, from the oak rooms, you experience it across the meadow, from chutes and ladders. So it's on display. And so to be able to orchestrate that in a way that makes it interesting and dynamic, create a materiality that also, as the sun passes through or the different seasons pass, you get this different experience every time. So thus we have the different roof shapes and all coming together. And yet, looking at, as I said earlier, various types of materials. There's stone, there's wood, there's different types of metal and concrete panel systems that we could also use. And all still while managing an internal program that's going to support the staff needs in terms of the activity rooms, being able to divide those, being able to join them, being able to also provide tornado shelter within the confines of the building. We have open pavilion. So if you have a camp set up, you might have an intake area over in the open pavilion and then bring everybody in, or maybe that's a pickup area. That could be a reception. It could be a living room for the community, for the neighborhood, if there's special events that want to happen. But being able to walk into the building through the entrance to the north and down into the space, you get these really magical glimpses of the park through these different view sheds. And then when you come out into the activity room, if you remember from the earlier renderings, the larger windows, the park opens up. You're up high, you get to look across, you get to look over and you see the oak rooms and all the play area. So it could be quite stunning for the neighborhood. Here are just some variations of thumbnail sketches of what those different pavilions could look like if we use the nomenclature that we've put together in base camp. And what you've just seen, we can start to take that and apply it to the various different types of shelters around the park. Some are completely open, some need to accommodate restrooms, maybe service spaces, storage. So there's a wide variety of ways that that concept could be applied. Now I'll turn it back over to Greg.
All right. We're into the home stretch here. So thanks, Janelle. So finally, kind of tying all that together is, again, a robust connection system. It is served by, again, we had a lot of discussion about the vehicular access and parking. We ultimately settled on having a north and a east or south entrance and pod of parking, with the primary lot being to the north. 75 to 100 cars is what we're showing right now, which will, again, be determined based on some of the programming of the pavilion, other things, 40 to 50 to the south. And then connected through a series of paved and in some cases aggregate trails as well, boardwalks, about 1.5 miles of trails that provides a series of smaller loops, larger loops, and then those connections ultimately into the greenway system. Kind of the by the numbers again, we are, well, right now, again, there's really is no entrance via trail today. You drive in the temporary lot that you have with the barn, so we would actually have 4 different entrances around the park, ultimately when it's built out. The trail system, it's a net increase of about 0.73 miles. That's on top. That's basically on top of the mown trails, the temporary trails that the parks put in this last year. So we end up with about 1.5 miles of trails when we're done. We actually taken a little bit of road out, so the former driveway from the house and the barn is a little bit shorter, smaller at the end of all of this. So kind of a net decrease in the vehicular footprint. For the road itself, the parking brings a little bit of acreage into it. And then the parking, we go from, right now there's 14 temporary spaces at the barn to somewhere between 115 and 150, depending on those ranges we have on the north and the south. And then when you kind of put it all together, this is just kind of a good glimpse of, again, the connections isn't just about physical connections. It's again, the idea of having those, those as well as those places to come together, to be seen, those spaces. This is an interesting, just sort of how it kind of all knits together sort of three-dimensionally here with the ground plane, the canopy, as well as how it starts to tie into some of the adjacent facilities. So that is the draft master plan. We have been looking at cost and funding cost and phasing options here as well. And we typically, when we work with Michael and his team, we typically do these in bundles and versus phases. So these are kind of cohesive projects that could, depending on, where funding is and needs, they can happen either on their own or together. and sort of be a standalone phase that could work. So that's worked really well for us, both in Central Park and West Park in the past. So there's 5 different bundles that I'll kind of quickly walk through. Bundle A is really kind of that north campus without the building. So bringing in some of the northern trails, the nature play, some of the first phase of trails, the parking lot, and that is about a $5.5 million just cohesive bundle. That would also have some of the shelters as well as one of the toilet facilities would be part of that. Bundle B is starting to bring in that adventure, so the tower and the adventure play, and some of the support for that, as well as the water play as well. So that would bring in the toilet that comes with that as well too. That's about a $4 million bundle or phase. Bundle C is the pavilion. The community pavilion and the surrounding plazas. The building is in the $3 million range. Again, the landscape, the site, the plazas and such bring it up to about a $6 million phase. And then Bundle D, which is really kind of the boardwalk, the ground plane, the rest of the trails, and the South Meadow area, the South Prairie picnic grove, shelters, toilets as well. And then finally, Bundle E would be the canopy play or the perch area and the support facilities that go with that. And then last but not least, Pros has been working with us on a performa. I won't go through all the details, but it's primarily a passive park. It does have again, I think we've tried to find a way that this is a very age diverse program, there are again a lot of passive uses, but I think the pavilion and the shelters in particular were probably from a revenue perspective, the more higher targeted, higher to medium there. The rest of it being again birding, the tree houses, trails, things like that as well too. And again, early projections. I don't know, Curtis, if you want to weigh in on this at all. I know you've been working a little more on this, but ultimately it's starting to get a sense of what this might look like from a cost recovery standpoint.
I mean, the main pieces from a cost recovery perspective are going to be the programmatic ability for summer camps of the program center that's going to be built in this space. And then obviously shelter rentals are always popular, so we will generate some revenue. I mean, it's debatable if that would be medium versus low, but I think the program center is going to allow us to offer, I think, at least 2 summer camps, maybe 3, with between 100 and 150 kids. So I think we're projecting revenue to be somewhere in the ballpark of around $250,000 annually. And then we'll have associated expenses for staffing and supplies and different stuff. So that obviously is going to operate at cost recovery. Everything else is going to be in that medium to low. So very, very passive, a very activated space, but we're not a lot of opportunity for cost recovery type activities within the park other than the program pavilion.
And it's very much the same strategy that we've used for pretty much Founders Park and West Park too, where we're not expecting to generate or don't envision generating tons of money. It's not like Central Park where you have the community center and you have the water park that brings in multi-million dollars. These are things that we definitely envision the program pavilion being self-sufficient, just as JPP is and just as Wilfong Pavilion is, but the rest of the park is passive and will be largely subsidized just like all of our other parks.
And that's it. So we've been on this adventure with the kids all along, and now adventure awaits you. So that concludes our presentation. Be happy to take some questions if you have them.
Questions? Mark?
Greg, brilliant as usual.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. And one of the things that I really, and I think you probably did it intentionally, is you had the geometric forms along with the winding of the creek, which is offset by your grid system of the oaks, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's brilliant.
And then the building sort of
I mean,
does
that
the
way
opposite.
the aliens can really get a perspective, or drones.
Yeah.
So I really like the look of that and the way it interacts with geometric and the natural areas as well. And the buildings, of course, are marvelous. When we talk about the creek area and thinning the canopy, and we did the same thing at Central Park. So the question that drifted through when you're talking about it is, what's long-term maintenance look like that? Is that something that it comes back naturally, or do we need to groom that over the years to keep it to a certain amount of thinning?
Well, hopefully more naturally than, again, we don't have fire, we don't have some of those natural things that, we don't have beavers and that would take some of those trees down, but hopefully it would be, again, I don't know the exact frequency, but it wouldn't be an annual, heavy thinning. And I think that's something we would work with the
I mean,
Carmel
on a
team.
decade or
What's that?
decade
Yeah,
type
I'd say,
basis.
5 to 10 year window versus annually would be probably what I think we're thinking.
That's what I was
Yeah.
wondering. So, and the other thing, and this has been a recurring theme that we've done in all the parks that I've been associated with that we built, is we always seem to run out of parking. And the estimates I think are great, but what I would like to see is that we could identify where additional parking might go, because I wouldn't say it's unimportant area, but it's space that we haven't developed into something special that could be sort of set aside for the future if it's needed.
Yep. No, that's a good point. I think we had some discussions, even some of those turf areas. I know, early West Park, some of the turf areas were program and they also were overflow parking, and I think that could be something to look at here. I think there is room to flex that as well too, but it is definitely a good point.
It was set up that way in West Park, but it was poorly laid out in the way it happened. And then we didn't do that at Founders Park, and that's been a real issue over the years after we developed it.
Yep.
So those are my only real thoughts. I think it's just really well done.
Great.
Thank you.
I do want to piggyback off of one thing that Greg said, and he talked about we don't have fire, but I don't want to give up on the concept of potentially having some controlled burns in this park. We do have some prairie areas, and Jim Ingledow Group in front of their business along 116th Street, they have a small prairie that they do burn every couple years. So I haven't given up on the concept of potentially having some periodic controlled burns out here as part of the programming. Obviously, it would have to be very specific. We would use professionals, but I do think that there's certainly potential for controlled burns in the site.
Michael, I have to point out that New Mexico was a controlled burn.
It would have to be in the right conditions.
a little smaller scale here too, but no, I think there's an opportunity to really creatively put that maintenance regime in place. I know Jay has, early ideas. I think Jay wants to sit up there on the plaza and watch the meadow burn as actually as a community event. So it could be anywhere, a wide range of that too. But I think that's something that, this is from the nice thing we're doing from scratch is that we can kind of build it in whatever it wants to be.
Greg, doesn't this concept also include armoring of the creek if the
some of the meanders, and just like again, like Carmel Creek isn't all natural. I mean, it meanders, and some of those bends and such are, whether it was stone veins or things like that too. So it would have definitely some of that built into it. It won't constantly meander like nature would let it. Otherwise, it would move every year. We would probably have it would look more natural than maybe it is.
Also, I am super disappointed because I really wish there would have been a video. We visited Collegewood Elementary. One of my most memorable experiences during this process was Greg singing to our after-school students, basically, which allowed them to pick the things that they liked most and the different renderings and things that they were providing. It was really a cool experience.
Video. Yeah, video does exist though. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Greg should have sung to the park board.
Yeah,
but-
next time. Yeah, this should have been a singing presentation.
Yeah, well, we can do a Bear Creek
Should
song.
have brought the whole band.
Maybe for implementation, we'll do a Bear Creek song.
The kids loved it, by the way.
Yeah, that was fun.
Questions, comments?
I have a question. When you mentioned the bundles, is there a plan of like which ones would have to come first? I guess like as you're building, like the pavilion before this or the creek before that. Or is it just simply a funding question?
It's a little bit of both. So if you look at bundles A and D, I sort of see those as the baseline bundle or baseline phases for the north and south. Without those, it's hard to do anything else. B and C bring in additional components, some of the more activated fun things on the north side. Bundle E brings in the canopy play, the chutes and ladders on the south side. So A and D are kind of the baseline bundles, and the other ones are to enliven it even further. we didn't go specific with phases because we want to have that exercise with the park board to see what the priorities are. And what we also found, especially with West Park, if you would have asked me when we finished the master plan, the updated master plan for West Park, I would have envisioned that the first phase of implementation was going to be the core area, and the second phase was going to be the groves. But because of how the funding opportunities came in, the groves came first, and the core is what we're underdoing now. So, it does give us a little bit of flexibility by doing these bundles to say, based on what money we get and what evolving priorities come as we're working on the funding formula, it gives us a little bit more mobility and not quite as fixed in stone.
Questions? Comments?
Comment. Lynn, I defer to Lynn.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and I have the opportunity to participate, by serving on the steering committee. It's long. It's the whole process, I would say it's long, comprehensive, inclusive process. I have a question here regarding the vision statement and how the concept plan tied to that. So the vision statement says the park will be an innovative, inclusive, and resilient community park. And you mentioned in your presentation resilience related to ecology. So I wonder if you could summarize very briefly how the concept plan here reflects the innovation and inclusive. So for example, innovation in terms of like the design or the facilities or the use of material, the inclusive of what?
Sure. Well, you just sort of answered some of the innovative. Some of it is definitely the flexibility. I think some of the things Janelle talked about, even with how there's sort of a modular design to this that I think makes it easier to sort of phase out and bundle. I think the idea of actually exploding some of the idea that what could be in a building is actually all throughout the site. You're immersed. The boardwalk is an outdoor classroom and things like that too. So I think, so there's definitely some innovation in that and some of the forms and materials. I think that's also part of the inclusivity as well too, that this idea that, this is very scalable, flexible. There's sort of a place for everybody in this park. I think, some of the feedback we got from like the teens, for example, that those tree houses, they could be, might be different age groups and things like that as well too. Again, I think how the building, how the outdoor spaces work, all could be, whether that's a camp, whether that's something more community based. I think the idea was to try to find just a lot of places where you could come together, small groups, larger groups as well, that embraced the single or the plurality of the community as well too. And then I think, again, into the details, I think the program that gets built around this park will be part of that as well, too. What are those camps? What are those activities that are going to be reflective of the community? I think is an opportunity, again, to be more inclusive. You want to add anything? Yeah.
I love your question because one of the central ideas behind the community outreach meetings was to draw in this melting pot that exists within those neighborhoods in that immediate area. And we had focused conversation with everybody that attended and represented each of the neighborhoods to understand what's important in your family. A lot of multi-generational families live in the area. So how do we create environments that can be geared toward small children and they can have fun, but then how do we gear that toward an aunt, an uncle, a grandpa, grandma as well, and be able to foster all of those various family units within one area. And so I think that was something that was really important to us and maybe isn't at the forefront of how we present it, but it's certainly an underpinning behind everything that we did. Mm-hmm.
And I also think, building off of what Janelle said, the actual planning process in and of itself was very innovative and inclusive. I mean, the degree that we reached out to different age groups is certainly not the standard in a lot of park planning efforts, and the types of trying to make sure that we get a broad breadth of the community that this particular park is going to serve. So that was both innovative and inclusive in trying to provide that feedback. So even through the planning process, we tried to live up to those values.
In the first 3 meetings, we actually designed the outreach. So we designed the program, how we wanted to approach all of that. So I think that is a big part of the innovation as well.
Questions, comments? I had a couple seen them. Oh, yes, Linus.
I don't think I've ever attended a presentation by you and your group that I haven't learned a lot. So I commend you for that, and the portrait that you've painted is really marvelous. And the second thing is, this is going to be a phenomenal facility once all the bundles are implemented and you get a little bit of growth on it, 18 months or so. It's just going to be, just based on what we know now. We've had some intelligent conversation. We've had some insightful observations. And I just feel that this is going to go someplace. Mm-hmm. This park has so much raw potential, mm-hmm. because we're starting with a blank piece of paper on that. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Linus. I just had some questions. The South Trail entrance, that aligns with the donation of land from the developer across the street. Or where would that cross-street access be?
It's in close proximity to that. So obviously we would be coordinating a little bit more closer when we get into schematics to make sure that it's a safe intersection there and taking into account where the other is. We also were pretty cognizant of where that drive is based on the feedback we had from the neighbors to the south, especially as you get further to the west, to provide a nice buffer on that drive to the neighbors. So we took into consideration both what's going on to the east and what's going on to what's existing to the south for the placement of that. But we'll hone in on that more specifically once we get into the schematics.
Yeah, because that current drive is right up to the property line.
Right. It's
of those neighbors.
I don't envision it being exactly where it is today.
Yeah. The other question, so with the main pavilion being 6,360 gross square feet, how does that compare to our two current pavilions? And I had some more questions about that.
Joe Perlman Pavilion is approximately 8,000 square feet, and Ralph Wilfong Pavilion is about 6,000 square feet, give or take. So it's a little bit closer to Wilfong.
And you said how many of the 2 to 3 camps, how many kids did you base your income estimates off of?
Between 150 and about 150 campers.
And then I just had one last question. So the Meandering Bear, one discussion we had was creating additional storage capacity for stormwater, rainwater. And then in the Bundle D for the stream bank restoration, did that estimate of $272,000 taken that into consideration? Or is that included in Bundle D, or am I missing that?
Additional storage or the creek?
Because the creek currently is not in this shape, in this preferred alternative, or the way it meanders. So in Bundle D, it took into account increasing the capacity and changing the shape.
Yeah. And then just by nature of that wet prairie area, that wet meadow area, the creek, it back to the resilience, that is going to give you the ability to manage more of that adjacent stormwater as well too. It can sort of do more on site. That was one of the ideas. One is the meandering creek is just a healthier ecosystem, more edges as well. But I think ultimately it could also take a little bit more of the hit that the development to your east is bringing more water in here too. So that would be part of the idea.
And I can't remember where it went with there's no consideration for regulated drain here.
Correct. While there was an inquiry that I did respond to, but they never got back with me about making this a regulated drain, which I'm not particularly interested in doing. So that isn't factored into this, that it would become, we'd rather control it.
Yes. Okay. Those are my questions.
Well, I
Anything
want
else for the team, Michael?
I'd like to thank Greg and Janelle and the entire team that helped us and guide us through this master planning process. As always, it's a delight to work with Greg and his team. I think it's an inspiring design. As Linus was saying, the potential, I mean, this is going to be an incredible jewel in our park system. And I'm looking forward to beginning to implement the vision that we've outlined within this master plan. Obviously, the hard work is to find now the money to do so. But I'm also looking forward to that conversation, and I believe there's going to be a lot of support to make this a reality, because it is in an area of the community that is so in need of additional green space. And because of how many people we had involved in the planning process, I'm hopeful that there's also a lot of advocates that will, as we're making the ask of our elected community leaders, that they'll also make the same ask on our behalf. So hopefully we can continue to keep them engaged in this process. But I'm very excited. I want to thank the SmithGroup team and Synthesis and Pros for the incredible high-quality work, for continuing to push us through an innovative public input process. The standards that we adopted for Central Park grew into what we did for West Park, to what we did for the Groves as we went into schematics and for the core, and have only continued to grow as we've gone into this. So we continue to raise the bar on how we do public input. Many of the things that we've done for Bear Creek Park, we're now also implementing into the planning concept for Thomas Marcaselli Nature Park. So I thank them for continuing to help push us, as I believe we've also helped push them as well. And very excited about it. The next steps from here is that we will be posting Greg's presentation on our website, as well as the slides, and providing the public at least 2 weeks to provide additional feedback that they may have with regard to it. There'll be a news release regarding this and pushed out on our social media as well. So we'll take that additional feedback, as well as any feedback the park board has. If you have some time as you're continuing to look through the draft document, which I emailed to everyone on Friday, if you have any questions or additional feedback, please get that to me, and we'll work with the team to make any appropriate adjustments. And then, depending on how much feedback we receive, or any adjustments that are necessary, we will bring the plan back to you in either June or July. No later than July for final adoption, and then that will become our vision as we begin to prepare for the future of Bear Creek Park.
Questions for Michael about the process? Seeing none, it was a coup to find this property to begin with, and pretty interesting how it all shook out. Thank goodness for banking and having a long-term relationship with a real estate agent that was quick to jump on the opportunity for us. So appreciate you, Jay O'Neill, now of Circle Realty, who found this property for us. And thank you to Janelle and Greg and your teams for the great presentation.